I think we need to understand a little bit about Major David Eldridge, because I do make a lot of jokes about him, but this guy is a very talented and has had incredible influence. I think you were nominated for Victorian of the Year. What year was that?
I don't know. I can tell you one thing about it.
Yes.
I came second to Ron Casey.
Ron Casey?
Yeah, you remember old Ron Casey used to do the footy show? Came second to Ron, he won Victorian of the Year. I got Metropolitan Victoria of the Year. Most important thing, 2 tickets to Alice Springs for the family.
Very good.
Yeah.
Because you're a Salvation Army officer, you had to give them back to headquarters?
Yeah, I might have.
And tell me, why were you nominated for Victorian of the Year? What was your...
Because I worked with the most fantastic bunch of social workers and youth workers you could ever find, except for Ingle Farm. But no, though, we had 10 years at Crossroads and just worked with a fantastic bunch of people, and I look good. Always get a good team, it's right, isn't it, David, eh?
That's right.
Yeah, you look good if you've got a good team.
Now, tell us about around 2004, I think it was, you used to go up and see the Prime Minister, John Howard, on a regular basis.
That makes me sound like I'm politically leaning one way.
It's not about political. You had
could
great
be leaning
knowledge.
another way.
You had great knowledge in a certain area. Why did you used to wander up there?
I won't go into the whole story, but when the Howard government first came in, so it was a bit earlier than that, they wanted to do something in youth homelessness, and it was a bit dicey actually. But they called a heads of churches meeting, and no one from the army wanted to go. So they sent along a little tow of church to represent the army, and there were all these people in this room, but none of them knew anything about youth homelessness. So they'd raise a question, and I'd wait for someone to answer. I said, you can't do that, because if you do that, this happens. So then I'd shut up again, and they'd ask another question, and Archbishop Hollingsworth and all the rest of them would look confused, and I'd go, but if you do that, this will happen. So this went on for a whole meeting. And then I think after the meeting, they asked Peter Hollingsworth if he'd chair the committee, and he said, no, I've just been made Archbishop of Brisbane, I don't want to do it. Get that Salvo bloke, he seemed to talk a lot. So
That's a great segue for you preaching. Someone who talks a lot.
Yeah, I ended up... Yeah. I like to do 30 minutes, 40-minute sermons. Is that all right?
50 is standard here, so...
Hutch says all is forgiven. Come back. You can talk as long as you like. Firstly, I do want to thank you for the invitation. It's been great. I've learned a lot. You know, you've got a fantastic team with Alan and his group. They're as good as any youth work, social work team I've seen anywhere. It's a comprehensive program. It's a compassionate program, and you should be really proud of it. It does amazing things in this community. So thanks, Alan and everybody, for that work. I got a Facebook message last night. It's going to be an interesting segue. I'll see if I can get away with this one. I got a Facebook message last night saying an old gentleman had died in England. We soldiered at the Stockport Corps. Now, it's not an unhappy thing, because he was in his 90s. When we were in England, he used to go every day up to the shopping centre and give out war cries and contact people. People came into the Corps because of Mr. Malcolm, and he'd been a great cornet player, but I think when he hit the 80s, he decided the vibrato made him sound like he was trilling, so he gave up cornet playing. But now I'm going to segue into a joke, because Mr. Malcolm reminded me of a joke. Because soldiers are the salt of the earth, salt of the Salvation Army. And there's this story about this old soldier of the Salvation Army. He'd served faithfully for 80 years in his corps, and he died and went to heaven. And St. Peter met him at the gates and said, look, this is terrific to have you here. Everybody's equal up here. You know, we've got the same houses, we've got the same opportunities. There's lots of things for you to do. You can join the Heavenly Choir. If you're skilled, you can join the Heavenly Orchestra. If you're not, you can play in the Heavenly Brass Band. And he thought, this is great. I'm going to enjoy this up here. Everybody's equal. We've all taken our place together. We've served faithfully. So he's settling in and things are going really well. And then after about 5 days, he wakes up to this huge sound of trumpets. And he looks out of his window and there's all these people running to the pearly gates. The choir, the orchestra, the brass band. It's just like a huge celebration. So he thinks he better go down there, and goes there, and there's Commissioner coming up the path to the pearly gate, and the bands are playing and the choirs are singing, and he's a bit peeved because he'd been told it was all equal. So after the parade and the big celebration, he said to St Peter, he said, what's going on? I thought you said we're all equal up here. He said, well, we are. He said, well, what was all that about? He said, oh, we've got hundreds of thousands of good soldiers up here. This is the first commissioner we've had in 10 decades. So, there are no retired commissioners here, are there? Just want to try and get out of the hall alive if I can. This is not being live streamed, is it? That relates to every commissioner except Commissioner Floyd Tidd, who I'm sure has an egalitarian approach to heaven. It has been good. Wasn't that bad, was it, Kylie? She can't believe I told that joke. Anyway, let me go back to my notes now. You'll be safer there. We are going to take a little time this morning to reflect on others. And you'll know the story of the telegram. A little bit vague about when it was. And allegedly it was a Christmas telegram to officers across the world. And the Salvation telegrams being a bit expensive, and also the army being a bit cheap. They thought, what's the best telegram we can send? A one-word telegram. And William Booth sent out this one-word telegram that said, others. And it's made an impact across the years. And I want us to take just a little time this morning to reflect on what others might mean for us today. You know, that reading from Matthew 25, it's the longest passage in the Bible about judgment. Isn't that interesting? There's all sorts of little passages across the Bible. There's not a lot about judgment and hell, but that's the longest passage. And really, it's focused around two things. It's really looking at how God might value and judge what we do with our lives. And I want us to assume this morning that we're the sheep in the passage, not the goats. So if all the goats can be quiet and the sheep pay a lot of attention. What are we like? What do we do? First off, it appears from that passage that we're to focus on others. The whole passage is about how we are with others, how we're to treat other people that we meet in our lives. But there's two other things that I've drawn from it, 2 points. To break up that passage, there's some practical things that we can do and some personal things that we can do with others. Some practical responses to others and some personal responses to others. What are the practical ones? Well, fairly clear. If others are hungry, we're to feed them. If others are thirsty, we're to give them a drink. If they're a stranger or homeless, we're to house them. If they're naked, we're to clothe them. They're fairly practical responses, aren't they? Practical responses that a whole lot of churches across the world have done, including the Salvation Army. And the personal responses, there's two key personal responses in there. The personal responses are we're to visit the sick and to visit people in prison. It's interesting, given a lot of the teaching of Jesus around the sick, we're not called to heal the sick. We're called to visit them. We're called to be with them in their time of difficulty. We're called to be there with their families and others. We're to be present with people in the difficult times of their life. And in prison, you came to me. The prisoners are amongst the most, I'm going to say alienated, but disliked almost people in the community. Prison is a place where we send bad people. What are we to do? We're to go to them, where they are in the prison. So practical and personal responses. I'm going to make a confession now. I left my Bible at home. No, I'm right. Because there was a Gideon's Bible in my room. So don't put down the Gideon's Bibles. It was very handy last night. It was in slightly older language. But it just reminded me of the passages as I heard it when I was young. Because even as a young person, this was a favourite passage of mine. Lessons that could be learnt for life. And I really took to it, particularly in my late teens. So it says in my Gideon's Bible that the call is to those, the sheep, the call is to those who are blessed of my Father, who get to inherit the kingdom. And you know what the response is of the sheep in that story? They're surprised. They're not expecting the reward. They're not expecting to inherit the kingdom. They're surprised. Their response is, when did I ever do the good thing? How come I'm being selected as someone who will inherit the kingdom? And Jesus says, whenever you did it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. So I like to think through these Bible stories, like to try and figure out what's going on there. So why did they do it? They didn't have the teaching of Matthew 25, did they? They had some Jewish teaching, which is very strong on justice and fairness and love. I suggest that they do it, and I suggest that we do these things when we've been touched by the Spirit of Jesus. When we've been touched by the Spirit of Jesus, compassion becomes part of our nature. It's part of our renewed nature that we experience. When we see Jesus, we respond and we want to serve others. There's a quote, I think, that we might be able to see now from Catherine Booth. A salvation that does not lead to service is no salvation at all. I think John Cleary used this in his talk on the first day of the conference. A salvation that does not lead to service is no salvation at all. It's built very strongly on the Wesleyan traditions. When you respond to Jesus, you're responding, you're going to do something. You're not just going to become a holy person who sits in a cave. You're going to do something significant. A salvation that does not lead to service is no salvation at all. And I want to briefly unpack what our service to others might look like today. And in unpacking it, we'll look at the practical service. That is the easiest one to understand. And we do it as individuals, as individual Christians, and we do it as an organisation. And I'll talk to the Salvation Army. We do serve meals to the hungry. And in a world where increasingly food security is a problem, increasingly the Army and other churches will be called upon to feed people. In the UK, with some huge welfare cuts, food banks have gone viral across the country. When we're in the UK for 3 years from 2003, I think. It's all a blur. I don't think I could visit a UK corps where they weren't doing community lunches, either for older people or for homeless people, community breakfasts. There are a lot of feeding programs in the Salvation Army in the UK. Brendan Nottle has a feeding program, a meals program, and he turned it away from being a sort of charitable meals program where meals were handed out to building what he called the Hammerdover Cafe, which is a free cafe in the centre of Melbourne. And I think they serve between 120 and 150 breakfasts every day, 5 days a week, and between 200 and 250 lunches, because for their group of people, food security is a daily issue. So we are to feed people. We are to water to the thirsty, clothes for the naked. Now, taking in strangers is a bit of a challenge, isn't it? I can't look at that photo of the young child. I really just can't look at it. It just stirs me up too much. It's such a tragic photo. But it's taken a photo like that to move people across the world. This has been going on for 20, 30 years. A world blown apart, places that are unsafe, and a tragic international refugee crisis. And what a mess we're making of it as a world, aren't we? You know, we've circled the wagons in some countries and we don't want to take people in. And we rationalise it in all sorts of ways. I think it must be hollow sounds to God's ears. This sort of, you know, we're stopping the boats, we're stopping them drowning at sea. So they can get killed where they are. Then it's not in our... I'm not saying it's a simple problem, but as Christians, we're called to take in the stranger. We have to think about this one very, very seriously. We move on to the sick and the visited in prison, and you came to me. And I want to expand that notion of sick. Physically, yes. Socially and emotionally, mentally. The 21st century curse is loneliness and marginalisation in first world countries. So many people just don't get out of their house, or they don't have friends, they don't have a circle, a network of friends. So lonely and marginalised people with no community. You know, at our best we do community pretty well in the Salvation Army. I grew up in a large corps in Brisbane. It's a judgment on me. I became a junior soldier illegally. Remember, you used to have to go at the front to be a junior soldier? And my grandfather, who was a retired officer, he was counselling at the Leighton Ford Crusade, which was Billy Graham's sort of offshoot. Often they'd send Leighton Ford into a country first and then Billy would come in later. So my grandfather was counselling and he took me along. Thought it was a pretty long meeting. I was a bit thirsty. Went down to ask my grandfather could I have a shilling to have a drink, and he thought I'd come out the front, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that I was only there to get a shilling for a drink. So I ended up with some young woman from an army corps somewhere because they knew I was army counselling me, and suddenly I'm a junior soldier. It was good. I didn't have to do that embarrassing out the front stuff with your mates and try and explain that. No, should I stop now, Kylie? Okay. But it was good. Look, I had a wonderful childhood in the Salvation Army and a wonderful adolescence and teenage years. I'm not going to pretend. I used to feel guilty when I was at Crossroads because all these kids had horrible lives. I had a great life. You know, I had parents who disciplined me and let me know the boundaries. Sometimes quite harshly. My father, I felt at the time, because that was the era when you did smack children. Your mother would meet Dad at the door and say, "Oh, you should have seen what he's done today." Off would come the belt. Fortunately, the era of thin belts too. And you'd learn to do the Russian dance, you know, where you could throw your legs forward just as the belt was coming down. It was great. So I wasn't hit too hard. Again, as part of my religious development, I used to sit up the back of Brisbane City Temple Corps because that's where the drunks used to come in. They were much more interesting than the sermon. But I did learn one thing. I learnt that quite austere Salvation Army officers who were retired and I was a bit scared of, they were magnificent with some of those drunks. They just had a natural skill to communicate. And, you know, I'd see incredibly, you know, my nose was more active than my heart in those days, and you'd smell these guys and you'd think, whoa. Next thing you'd see an old army officer in an immaculate uniform with his arm around this guy talking to him. Compassion in action. I went to another corps, Albion, when my parents had a brief flirtation with Methodism, and I was so awkward they said I could go to the army but I couldn't go to the temple, it was too far. So I went to a corps called Albion, and I went to the first meeting and this couple said, they were a couple in their 40s, we'll give you a lift home because we live out your way. So they gave me a lift home, and then they said to me, you want to come to the meeting tonight, I'll pick you up. And then they picked me up for band practice, for everything, 3 times a week. They used to pick me up on Friday nights and take me to youth group. And I'd say, oh, you don't go to youth group. No, that's all right. Someone else will drop you home. We're going shopping. And then I think back, there was no late night shopping then. Don't know where they were shopping. They were just getting me to youth group. They did that for 2.5 years. That's community. That's people caring. That's us at our best. I went to Box Hill for a little while and I got to wear a festival tunic. And then all my mates left the band. And I thought, oh, don't know if I can tour the world with these guys without my mates. So I went to Kunang, which was a smaller corps than I'd ever been in, North Box Hill. When I first went there, it was. And I had the joy of seeing a church grow. I was given responsibility along with my friends, 19-year-old youth group leaders. What a mess we made of that sometimes. But it was community. People mentored us and gave us an opportunity. By the time we were taking corps ourselves at Fitzroy in Brunswick, we'd learned about community, Gloria and I. She'd come into the army at Kunang through netball and found a family, an alternative family. So when we do it well, we do community good in the Salvation Army, and I can look at people here who've been great embracers of warm and inclusive communities. But that's what we're called to, aren't we? Not all corps are healthy. I don't want to give the impression that everything's rosy in the Salvation Army, but when we do get it right, we do it well. And in my experience, when we do it well is when we're inclusive. not closed. When we give others our attention, not focus inwards and on ourselves. So meeting material needs is great. That's probably the easy one. Meeting people in emotional isolation and loneliness, their poor self-esteem, that's life-changing for them. And it can also be life-changing for us. Alan, you would have seen kids who you gave no hope to, no chance to, and someone's invested in them, and they've grown, and they've become engaged, and their lives are turned around. Life-changing experience of having a friend. There's two more quotes there from Simone Weil. Those who are unhappy have no need for anything in this world but people capable of giving them their attention. Those who are unhappy have no need for anything in this world but people capable of giving them their attention. Read the stories of Jesus, so attentive to small things, so aware of Zacchaeus in the tree, the woman who touched his garment. All those Bible stories are about an attentive God in human form who embraced people and gave people's life meaning. He turned people around. Simone went on to say, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Giving people our attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. I'm going to put up a quote from another great philosopher. Simone Weil was a philosopher. This is that famous philosopher, Dr. Seuss. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better, it's not. Isn't that a great quote to have in a children's book? Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better, it's not. That's our call to be caring and compassionate people. See, attention is the heartbeat of compassion, and compassion is the hallmark of the Christian. That's what we're called to do. That's who we're called to be. Service to others is a challenge. It's not easy, and I won't pretend that it's easy. It calls for sacrifice. I think Commissioner Dennis Hunter at the 1980 Congress in Adelaide, part of which we relived yesterday. But Dennis Hunter said in a sermon, and it's one of the few sermons I remember more than 10 years on, he talked about the need for Christians to be self-forgetful. So sacrifice, self-forgetfulness, setting aside our own agendas and our plans and our lifestyle. And that can be demanding and frustrating. Sometimes it's boring. There are moments in my life that seem to take hours, listening for the 15th time to the same story from the same kid, with a slight variation. But in those 15 or 20 experiences, you learn something a little bit more about the person each time. The story might sound the same, but there's little nuances in it, and you're thinking, I didn't realise that about him or her. I didn't realise that about them. I didn't realise that. And all the time you're listening to them, they're feeling valued. It's not a great inconvenience in your life, is it? So when I get some of the phone calls from past Crossroads kids, and I know it's going to take an hour on the phone, I have been known to say, I'll call you back and wait till I'm driving back to Geelong or driving up to Melbourne, because then it doesn't matter how long the call is. But it's important that we give people our attention. And I'll say again, let's be clear, it's a life that we're called to live, where sacrificial love and compassionate service will cost you. But in the words of William Booth, no cross, no crown. The world we live in is a mess. And this morning, I want to challenge you all here this morning to do two things. Firstly, I want to challenge you to feel for those who have been broken for life, because it's initially in your feeling for them that a relationship can begin. And I'm not talking about sympathy. I think compassion is a much deeper feeling than sympathy for someone. And William Barclay, in his translation of some of the stories of Jesus, when Jesus feels compassion towards someone, Barclay translates it as Jesus was heart sorry for that person. Isn't that a great quote? Jesus was heart sorry for that person. Not just, I'm really sorry for so-and-so, he's had a rotten life. No, right in there, it's heart sorry for that person. It's deep and it's meaningful. If you've ever read the children's book, The Little Prince, anyone read it? All adults should read The Little Prince. It's got 1 million life messages in it. But he says in The Little Prince, it's only with the heart that one can see rightly. It's only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. So I want us to feel for people. Feel for those who've been broken in life. And the second thing I want us to do this morning is do something about it. There's a great image. I didn't read much when I left school, I'll confess. I didn't read much, and then one day a friend gave me a little book called Include Me Out. It was by Colin Morris, who was a Methodist minister in Zambia. Colin Morris had been in charge of the largest Methodist church in the capital. And he woke up one morning, huge church. He was very involved in the ecumenical movement, so he'd be going from meeting to meeting, talk about churches combining and ecumenicalism. He woke up one morning and he went out and found a dead African, dead Zambian in his front yard. And he had a loincloth and a big biro in his hand. He called it his sceptre. He said it turned his life around. It pointed out to him the meaninglessness of running from this to that meeting, fixing up the structures of the church. And he said, include me out of those things. I want to be engaged in hand-to-hand fighting to change the world. You're doing that here, but you can do it in your personal lives as well, with the people that you meet. You can do it in your street, in your neighbourhood. And I think all Army Corps and all Salvationists should be knee-deep in neighbourhood to make a difference. But you can make a difference through your programs that you run in the community, through the core programs, which can take in people who are lonely and isolated, through your church services, which can be inclusive and focused and relevant. Rev was great the other night. There wasn't one thing in Rev that made me great. You know, sometimes you go to youth things and you think, oh, don't say that. Some of these kids have got no church back. Not a thing. It was really relevant. That's who we are. We've got to be relevant. We've got to make friends, and we've got to be a compassionate friend. We've got to break down walls and build up communities that care.